The boy arrived at Mercy Ridge Hospital without shoes. Rain soaked his sweatshirt. Blood covered one sleeve, but the wound was not his. Nora Hayes met him beneath the emergency entrance lights. She was 54, plus size, and calm under pressure. After 30 years in emergency care, very little surprised her. This boy did. He looked about 14. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his hands shook badly. "Are you hurt?" Nora asked. He shook his head. "Then whose blood is that?" The boy looked toward the parking lot. A black SUV had stopped near the ambulance lane. 3 men stepped out. 2 scanned the entrance with sharp, controlled movements. The 3rd man walked directly toward the hospital doors. Vincent Moretti. Nora recognized him from the news. Chicago called him a businessman. Detectives used other words behind closed doors. The boy grabbed Nora's wrist. "Please don't tell him I'm here." His voice barely carried over the rain. Nora looked down at his frightened face. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Daniel." The hospital doors opened. Vincent entered without raising his voice. He did not need to. The waiting room grew quiet around him. "I'm looking for a boy," he said. Nora stepped in front of Daniel. "This is a hospital." Vincent's gaze moved to her badge. "I can read. Then you know patients have rights." One of his men shifted forward. Vincent stopped him with one raised hand. The boy is 14. Dark hair. Scar beneath his left ear. Nora had seen that scar while checking Daniel's pulse. She kept her expression steady. "What happened to him?" "That is what I intend to learn." Daniel's fingers tightened around her wrist. Vincent noticed. His face changed slightly. Not with anger, with recognition. "He told you his name." Nora did not answer. Vincent stepped closer, but stopped several feet away. "I am not here to hurt him. Men like you always say that first." The waiting room became even quieter. Vincent studied her for a long moment. Then he reached inside his coat. Hospital security moved toward him. "Easy," Vincent said. He removed a faded photograph. A young woman stood beside him in the picture. She held a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Around the baby's neck was a small gold chain. Nora looked behind her. The same chain rested against Daniel's wet sweatshirt. Vincent saw her reaction. His voice became low. "My son wore that necklace the day he died." Daniel moved closer to Nora. She felt his fear before he spoke. "My mother said he would come looking." Vincent stared at him. "Who was your mother?" Daniel said nothing. Nora already knew the answer. She had promised that woman she would protect him, even from his own father. Vincent stepped forward. Nora blocked him again. "The boy stays with me." Vincent's eyes hardened. Then Daniel whispered a name that had been buried for 13 years. Elena Moretti. Vincent stopped moving, because Elena had been his wife, and Daniel had been buried beside her. Vincent stared at Daniel as though the room had tilted beneath him. "Elena Moretti," he repeated. Daniel lowered his eyes. Nora felt his grip tighten around her wrist. Vincent looked at the boy's face again. The dark hair, the scar beneath his ear, the chain resting against his chest. Then he looked at Nora. "You knew. I knew his mother." "That was not my question." Nora held his gaze. "Yes." One of Vincent's men stepped forward. "Boss, we should move him." Nora turned sharply. "You will not touch him." Vincent raised one hand. The man stopped. Daniel looked at Vincent with open fear. "You really are my father?" Vincent's expression changed. The power stayed. The coldness did not. "I was told you died." Daniel swallowed. "My mother said you believed that." "Where is she?" Silence answered him. Nora had delivered bad news to hundreds of families. She knew how grief changed a person's face before the tears came. "She died 6 months ago," Nora said. Vincent did not move. "How?" "Cancer." He looked away for the first time. The hospital sounds returned around them. Phones rang. Wheels moved across tile. A nurse called for a doctor. Vincent heard none of it. Daniel pulled his hand from Nora's wrist. "She made me promise not to contact you." Vincent looked back at him. "Why?" She said people around you wanted me dead. One of Vincent's men glanced toward the entrance. Nora noticed. So did Vincent. What happened tonight? He asked. Daniel stared at the blood on his sleeve. A man came to our apartment. What man? I don't know. Did he say anything? Daniel nodded. He asked for the necklace. Vincent's eyes dropped to the gold chain. Nora stepped closer to Daniel. Tell him the rest. The boy looked at her. You said not to trust him. I said not to trust anyone too quickly. Vincent's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Daniel reached beneath his sweatshirt and pulled out the necklace. A small gold medallion hung from the chain. He pressed the edge with his thumb. It opened. Inside was a folded strip of paper. Vincent stared at it. What is that? My mother said it proves why she ran. Nora had never seen the paper before. That frightened her more than anything else. Daniel handed the medallion to Vincent. Before he could open the note, the hospital lights flickered. Then every screen in the waiting room went black. A second later, the emergency doors locked. Vincent's men drew their weapons. Hospital security shouted from the far hallway. Nora pulled Daniel behind the nurse's station. Vincent looked toward the dark entrance. Someone had followed the boy inside. Then, a calm voice came through the hospital intercom. Bring me the necklace, Vincent. The voice paused. Or your son dies twice. The waiting room went silent. Even the monitors had stopped beeping. Nora kept Daniel behind the nurse's station. Her hand rested firmly on his shoulder. Vincent stood in the center of the room, holding the open medallion. Who are you? He asked. The intercom crackled. You already know. Vincent's expression did not change, but one of his men did. Marco, the younger guard, looked toward the east hallway. Vincent noticed. So do you, he said. Marco went pale. Nora followed their eyes. A service corridor ran behind radiology. It connected to the loading dock, laundry room, and emergency power controls. Someone inside the hospital knew the building well. The voice returned. Leave the necklace at the security desk. Vincent looked at the folded paper inside the medallion. What do you want with this? You were never good at asking the right question. Daniel leaned closer to Nora. I know that voice. Her stomach tightened. From where? He called my mother. Vincent turned toward him. When? Before she died. Daniel's breathing became uneven. He told her running would not save me. Nora moved in front of him. Look at me. Daniel did. Slow breath in. Slow breath out. Vincent watched her calm his son. For the first time, his authority seemed useless. The intercom clicked again. 1 minute. Vincent handed the medallion to Nora. She looked at him. What are you doing? Giving him what he expects. Nora opened her palm. The gold chain lay across it. You trust me now? No. His answer came quickly. But Daniel does. That honesty surprised her. Vincent turned toward his men. Marco, take the south stairs. Marco did not move. Vincent's eyes hardened. I said move. Marco reached inside his coat. Nora pulled Daniel lower. Vincent's other guard drew first, but Marco fired into the ceiling. The sound exploded through the waiting room. Patients screamed from the locked hallway. Marco backed toward the east corridor. Give me the necklace. Vincent stepped between him and Nora. You helped them find my son. Marco's hand shook. I had no choice. There is always a choice. Not when they have your family. Vincent glanced toward the intercom. The hidden voice had found leverage inside his own crew. Nora closed her fingers around the medallion. Marco pointed the gun at Daniel. Give it to me. Daniel froze. Vincent took one slow step forward. You will not aim at my son again. Marco's breathing became ragged. Then the emergency lights flashed back on. For 1 second, every face was visible. Nora saw the security camera above the desk turn toward her. A red light blinked. Someone was watching live. Then Daniel looked down at the paper inside the medallion. A single name was written across it. He whispered it aloud. Samuel Hayes. Nora stopped breathing. That was her dead husband's name. Nora stared at the paper in Daniel's hand. Samuel Hayes. Her husband had been dead for 9 years. At least, That was what the police report said. Vincent turned toward her. You know that name. Nora's fingers tightened around the medallion. He was my husband. Marco's gun lowered slightly. That hesitation was enough. Vincent's guard crossed the floor and struck Marco's wrist. The weapon hit the tile. Vincent kicked it away before Marco could recover. Secure him, Vincent said. The guard forced Marco against the wall. Nora barely noticed. Her eyes stayed on the folded paper. Daniel looked at her. You said he died in a car accident. He did. Vincent picked up the note. Was there a body? Nora looked at him. The question cut deeper than it should have. The car burned. That was not my question. She hated his calm voice. It made lying harder. No, she said. There was no body. Daniel stepped back. You knew? I believed the police. You always told me never to believe something just because an official said it. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second. He was right. The intercom came alive again. This time, the voice sounded amused. Now, we are finally telling the truth. Nora looked toward the ceiling speaker. Samuel? Silence followed. Then the voice answered. Hello, Nora. Her knees nearly gave out. Vincent moved beside her, close enough to catch her if needed. She stayed standing. You let me bury you. I needed you to believe it. For 9 years. I was protecting you. Nora laughed once. It came out broken. You do not get to call abandonment protection. The intercom clicked. Bring Daniel to radiology. Vincent looked toward the east hallway. No. Then I released the hospital records. Nora's stomach tightened. What records? Samuel continued. Medication changes. Missing samples. Children admitted under false names. Daniel looked at Nora. What is he talking about? She had no answer. Vincent did. He used the hospital. Nora turned toward him. How would you know? Vincent unfolded the note completely. Beneath Samuel's name was a list of dates. Every date matched a night Nora had worked. Her breathing slowed. Samuel had not chosen this hospital by accident. He had chosen her. The lights above radiology came back on. One door opened at the end of the corridor. A man stepped into view. He was older now. His hair had gone gray, but Nora knew the way he stood. Samuel Hayes looked directly at her. Then he raised a hospital access badge bearing Nora's name. I never left your life, he said. I built everything inside it. Samuel stood beneath the radiology lights, holding Nora's stolen access badge. For 9 years, she had pictured him trapped inside a burning car. Now he looked older, thinner, and completely alive. Daniel stayed close to Nora. Vincent stepped in front of them. You used her credentials, he said. Samuel smiled without warmth. I used what she gave me. Nora's voice shook. I gave you nothing. You gave me trust. That was before you turned my life into a crime scene. Samuel's expression barely changed. You always were dramatic. The insult brought back a memory Nora hated. Samuel had used that tone whenever she questioned him. Calm, dismissive, certain she would eventually doubt herself. She did not doubt herself now. You altered hospital records, she said. I corrected them. You hid children under false names. I kept them away from dangerous families. Vincent's stare hardened. You mean families like mine? Samuel looked at him. Your wife understood the danger before you did. Daniel flinched. Nora felt it. Do not use Elena's name, she said. Samuel ignored her. Elena came to me 13 years ago. She wanted Daniel erased from every system your enemies could search. Vincent looked toward his son. She trusted you. For a while. What changed? Samuel's smile disappeared. She learned I was selling identities. The hallway seemed colder. Nora stared at him. You sold children's records. I moved people who needed new lives. For money. For survival. You stole from terrified families. Samuel stepped closer. Be careful, Nora. Vincent moved between them again. She asked you a question. Samuel's eyes shifted toward him. You still think power makes you the judge? No. Vincent's voice stayed quiet. But I know guilt when I see it. Behind them, Marco struggled against the guard holding him. "Boss, he has people downstairs." Samuel glanced toward the security camera. "So helpful, Marco." Vincent looked at his former guard. "You traded my son for your family." Marco's face twisted. "They have my wife." Samuel shook his head. "No, they don't." Marco went still. Samuel continued. "She left you 6 months ago. You were too proud to admit it." The truth struck harder than a threat. Marco stopped fighting. Nora watched Samuel with growing horror. He knew where every weakness lived. That was his real weapon. Samuel lifted a small remote. "The emergency doors open when I release this switch." Vincent looked at the device. "What happens if you press it?" "Radiology seals." Nora glanced toward the hallway. Patients were still trapped nearby. Samuel had planned every route, every reaction, every fear. Daniel stepped out from behind Nora. "You want the necklace?" Samuel looked at him. "I want what your mother hid inside it." Daniel held up the medallion. "Then take it." Nora turned sharply. "Daniel, no." The boy opened his hand. The folded paper was gone. Samuel noticed immediately. "Where is it?" Daniel looked toward Nora. She understood. While everyone watched the gun, Daniel had slipped the note into her scrub pocket. Samuel raised the remote. "You have 10 seconds." Vincent took one slow step forward. Samuel pressed the button. Steel doors slammed down across the corridor. Then smoke began pouring from the radiology vents, and Nora realized Samuel had never come to escape. He had come to erase everyone who knew the truth. Smoke rolled from the radiology vents and spread across the ceiling. Patients screamed behind the sealed doors. Nora covered Daniel's mouth with her sleeve. "Stay low." Vincent grabbed a metal chair and struck the emergency panel beside the corridor. Nothing happened. Samuel watched from the other side of the glass. "You cannot break a magnetic lock that way." Vincent hit it again. "I can try." Nora looked toward the nurses' station. The emergency system had failed, but the old fire controls still used manual release cables. Most staff had forgotten they existed. Nora had not. She turned to Daniel. "Do you trust me?" He nodded. "Then stay with Vincent." Daniel looked at Samuel. "What are you doing?" "Getting those doors open." Samuel raised the remote. "Move away from the wall, Nora." She ignored him. Vincent caught her arm. "Tell me where to go." "This hospital was renovated 10 years ago. The old fire release runs behind the medication room." "How do you know?" "I helped inspect it." A faint smile touched Vincent's face. "Of course you did." They moved through the smoke together. Marco remained against the wall, guarded and shaken. His eyes followed Samuel through the glass. "Boss," he called. "The loading dock connects to radiology." Vincent did not stop. "You already helped him once." "I know." Marco looked at Daniel. "Let me fix one thing." Vincent studied him for 1 second. Then he nodded to his guard. "Take him with you. Watch him closely." Nora reached the medication room and pulled open the lower cabinet. Behind a row of supply boxes sat a rusted red handle. She wrapped both hands around it. It did not move. Vincent joined her. Together, they pulled. The cable groaned inside the wall. Samuel's calm finally cracked. "Nora, stop." She pulled harder. The first steel door rose 6 inches. Fresh air moved beneath it. Patients dropped to the floor and crawled toward the opening. Nora kept pulling until her palms burned. The door lifted high enough for staff to drag people through. Daniel helped an older man across the tile. Vincent looked at his son. Pride replaced fear for one brief moment. Then Samuel pressed another button. A loud blast shook the loading dock. The ceiling lights failed. Marco disappeared into the darkness. Vincent drew his weapon. Nora grabbed Daniel and pulled him behind the counter. When the emergency lights returned, Samuel was gone. So was Marco. On the floor near the open radiology door lay a hospital badge. It belonged to Samuel. A note had been taped across the back. Nora read it aloud. "Bring the original records to Street Agnes Cemetery." Vincent looked toward her scrub pocket. The note from the necklace. Nora touched it. Samuel had failed to get the evidence. Now he wanted to trade for it. Daniel stared at the message. Street Agnes is where my mother is buried. Vincent's face hardened. No. Daniel looked at him. What? Vincent folded the badge in his hand. Elena was never buried there. And for the second time that night, Daniel learned his mother's grave had been a lie. Street Agnes Cemetery sat beyond the city limits, surrounded by bare trees and frozen ground. Vincent drove himself. Nora sat beside him, holding the folded note from the medallion. Daniel remained in the back seat with one of Vincent's guards. No one spoke for most of the drive. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. If my mother isn't buried there, then who is? Vincent kept his eyes on the road. No one. Daniel leaned forward. You bought an empty grave. I bought a place people would stop searching. Nora turned toward him. You knew she was alive? No. His answer came quickly. I believed she had escaped. The grave protected Daniel's identity if anyone checked the records. Daniel looked out the window. So, everyone lied. Vincent's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Yes, the honesty did not comfort him. They reached the cemetery just before dawn. Samuel's instructions led them to a stone mausoleum near the northern wall. Elena Moretti's name had been carved across the front. Daniel stopped several feet away. He stared at the dates beneath her name. She died 6 months ago. Nora stood beside him. I know. Then why does this say 13 years? Because someone needed the world to stop looking. Daniel looked at Vincent. And you let them. Vincent accepted the accusation. I did. A phone began ringing inside the mausoleum. Vincent opened the iron door. The sound came from a small black phone resting on the empty stone shelf where a coffin should have been. He answered. Samuel's voice filled the chamber. Place the original note inside the grave. Nora looked around. The mausoleum had one entrance and no windows. Where is Marco? Vincent asked. Alive. For now? Samuel laughed softly. You still think fear only belongs to other people. Vincent's face stayed still. Nora heard the threat clearly. Samuel continued. Leave the note and walk away. Nora stepped closer to the phone. You already know what it says. No. I know what Elena wanted people to believe. Daniel looked at her. What does that mean? Samuel answered before Nora could. Your mother did not hide evidence against me. The line went quiet. She hid evidence against Vincent. Daniel stared at his father. Vincent did not move. Nora unfolded the note. Until that moment, she had only seen Samuel's name and the list of dates. Beneath them, in smaller handwriting, Elena had added one final sentence. Vincent ordered the first relocation. Nora read it twice. Then she looked at him. What relocation? Vincent's face changed, not with guilt, with recognition. Before he could answer, the mausoleum door slammed shut behind them. A metal lock clicked into place. Then gas began hissing through the vents. Samuel's voice returned through the phone. One of you already knows how this story ends. The gas hissed through the mausoleum vents. Daniel covered his mouth with his sleeve. Nora moved toward the sealed door and pulled the iron handle. It would not move. Vincent looked toward the stone shelf beneath Elena's name. Behind the plaque, Nora turned. What? The emergency release is behind the plaque. You said you never used this place. I didn't. Vincent crossed the chamber and pressed both hands against the carved stone. But I built it. Daniel stared at him. You built my mother's grave. Vincent did not look back. I built a lie to keep you alive. He pushed harder. The plaque shifted half an inch. Nora joined him. Together, they forced the stone aside. A narrow metal lever appeared behind it. Vincent pulled. Nothing happened. Samuel's voice came through the phone. You always needed someone else to clean up your mistakes. Vincent grabbed the lever again. This mistake was mine. He pulled with both hands. A cable snapped inside the wall. The vent stopped. Then, the mausoleum door unlocked. Fresh air rushed inside. Daniel stumbled out first. Nora followed, coughing hard. Vincent came last. Samuel stood near the tree line. Marco knelt beside him with his hands tied. A dark bruise covered one side of his face. Samuel held a gun against his shoulder. "Bring me the note," he said. Nora stepped forward. "No," Samuel smiled. "You still protect men who lie to you. I am protecting a boy." She held the folded paper in one hand. Daniel stood behind Vincent. "What did my father order?" Vincent turned toward him. 13 years of silence sat between them. "I ordered your mother relocated." Daniel's face hardened. "Why?" "Because someone inside my organization planned to kill her." "Samuel?" "No." Vincent looked toward Marco. "Marco's father." Marco closed his eyes. Vincent continued. "I trusted Samuel to create new records. He used them to build a business." Nora looked at her husband. "You sold their identities." Samuel shrugged. "I gave desperate people options. You gave criminals access to frightened families." Samuel's expression cooled. "They paid better." Nora unfolded the note. Elena's final sentence continued on the back. "Vincent ordered the first relocation. Samuel sold the second." Nora raised the paper. "This does not condemn Vincent." Samuel's smile disappeared. "It proves you betrayed Elena. It proves she knew exactly who you were." Marco suddenly drove his shoulder backward. Samuel lost his balance. Vincent crossed the distance before the gun could rise. He struck Samuel's wrist and forced him to the ground. The weapon slid across the frozen grass. Nora picked it up and held it away from everyone. Police lights appeared beyond the cemetery gates. Vincent looked at her. "You called them?" "Before we left the hospital." For the first time, he almost smiled. Samuel was arrested before sunrise. The records tied him to false identities, stolen files, and multiple disappearances. Marco agreed to testify in exchange for protection for his family. Vincent surrendered every document connected to Elena's relocation. He did not ask Daniel to forgive him. He asked for time. 6 months later, Daniel still lived with Nora. Vincent visited every Sunday. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they sat in silence. Nora never forgot the lies that brought them together. Neither did Vincent. But trust did not return through promises. It returned slowly, one honest choice at a time. Do you think Vincent deserved the chance to know his son? Share your thoughts, and stay with us for more emotional stories.